Hey, everybody. It is Monday, March 3rd, new month, same podcast. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. And Jill, we're marking a big milestone over on our Instagram page.
500,000 followers. How's that?
What's the song from Rent, the musical?
500. Well, what is the number? I was sort of like going with that, and then I realized it wasn't the right number, and so I just went into a different.
It's 525,600 minutes.
So what are we at? 500.
We're at like
it's more than 500,000.
Yeah. We got caught up with all the breaking news, so we missed our opportunity when we actually broke 500,000 followers on Instagram, and so we're at about 515 now. So we are nearly at the number of minutes in a year from Seasons of Love and Rent. 525,000. By the way,
how do you measure a year?
By the way, if you ever ask somebody how many minutes are in a year, you know if they've seen the play Rent because 525,600. That's a song.
And I dare them not to sing it.
Well, anyway, we're singing, and we're so grateful to everyone who's followed us, who's told their friends, their family, their neighbors, their colleagues about the Mo News Instagram page. And so we are more than halfway to 1 million right now, Jill.
So I was reading a bunch of the comments, and there was someone who was like, that's it? I would think you guys were more than that. But she meant it as a compliment. She wasn't like, oh, look at you guys giving yourselves a pat on the back for 500,000. She was just like, I thought you would have more.
Right. How could millions of people not be following you by now? One of the challenges we face is, and I talk about this, like by not picking a side, we actually make things more challenging when it comes to the social media algorithm. You tend to do better if you put up extreme content, if you put up controversial content, if you put up incendiary content, and then it leads to like big fights. And so ultimately, by trying to be a nonpartisan news source, I've gotten lots of notes, and we share them sometimes like, oh my God, you guys are so right wing, I can't follow you anymore. Oh my God, you guys are so left wing, I can't follow you anymore. And so, we lose on the edges, but slowly and surely making our way up the mountain.
The problem is that we're trying to turn down the temperature.
Correct. On a platform where turning up the temperature means more followers. But it's all good because I think we're onto the right mission here, and the same thing we're trying to do on this podcast. Actually, it's funny, in the podcast world too, Jill, if you look at the top 10 news podcast rankings over on Apple, they all tend to be partisan. The vast majority of them have very much on one side or the other side. So same challenge in this world as well as over on Instagram.
So Mo, should we make this like a crossfire every day? I'll take one position, you take the other.
And just like we fight it out. Or we could just like on Mondays we go Republican, on Tuesdays we go liberal, on Wednesdays like who knows? And then you just like you'll never know, people.
I think we should just stick with what's working.
I agree with that.
Okay, on that note, the headlines, starting with the big story of the weekend, that explosive meeting between President Trump and Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky, the reaction, how everyone is reacting from the US to Russia and everywhere in between, and European leaders call an emergency summit in London to show their support for Ukraine and to come up with their own plan for peace.
Jill, it was a remarkable 10 minutes in the Oval Office, something we have never seen on camera before. We've been answering questions, nearly 200 slides over the weekend over on the Mo News Premium page, answering all your questions. And so we'll try to take a moment here on the podcast, break down exactly what happened, why we think it happened, and what we think might happen next.
Continuing our coverage in Washington, Elon Musk directs a new email sent out to federal workers asking them again to list their accomplishments or face repercussions. But the only thing different this time, more agencies are following his orders.
And we'll tell you which Saturday Night Live legend came back this weekend to now play Elon Musk.
And turns out there's some wiggle room on those 25% tariffs set to go into effect on Canada and Mexico tomorrow. We have got the latest. Overseas, the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas ended over the weekend, and so far there's no agreement to extend it, which means the war could be back on this week. In New York City, big news in the race for mayor. Former Governor Andrew Cuomo has announced he is running to unseat incumbent Mayor Eric Adams 3 years after resigning amid sexual harassment allegations. 3 years after resigning amid sexual harassment allegations.
He's back, everybody. Andrew Cuomo. We'll break down what we know.
And we've got a breakdown on the big winners at the Oscars. And finally, Moshe has on this day in history.
Jill, any idea how many years we went as a country here in the U.S. without an official national anthem?
100?
Relatively close.
Whoa.
We will tell you about it on this day in history.
Okay, the story shaking up the world order. Fallout from that explosive meeting on Friday between President Trump and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office. European leaders met Sunday with Zelensky to figure out a path forward for Ukraine, given that the U.S. made it clear that it will not be supporting Ukrainian security after a ceasefire. European leaders met on Sunday with Zelensky to figure out a path forward for Ukraine, given that the United States has made it clear that it will not be putting troops on the ground or making any promises to repel a future Russian invasion or letting Ukraine into NATO.
Yeah, the Trump administration taking a very different line here that's leading to a major shakeup.
The scramble came after Trump, Zelensky, and Vice President J.D. Vance got into a heated shouting match in front of the media at the White House on Friday, ahead of a scheduled meeting to sign a much-anticipated multi-billion-dollar minerals deal. The in-person meeting was meant to cool things down after a contentious back and forth in recent weeks, but it did the opposite. The fight broke out over U.S. security guarantees in Ukraine post-war. Vice President Vance suggested that the countries need to work something out diplomatically after more than 3 years of war with a ceasefire, and that it's past time that the U.S. engage Russia diplomatically to get a deal. Zelensky responded by saying that Russian President Vladimir Putin has broken previously negotiated deals and can't be trusted. He challenged the U.S. on how it would protect its European allies. Trump then called Zelensky disrespectful, while Vance reprimanded him for being ungrateful. The fight happened around the 40-minute mark of their media appearance that was otherwise pretty diplomatic and calm, but the heated back and forth lasted for about 9 minutes. We're not going to play the entire thing, but here's about 2 minutes of it, starting with Zelensky questioning why Putin should be trusted after breaking previous deals.
He broken this ceasefire. He killed our people, and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military?
We have problems.
And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You
God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's exactly what you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having
I'm not
cards.
playing cards.
Right now, you don't.
You're
playing cards. You're playing cards.
Serious.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once? This
A lot
entire
of
meeting?
times.
No, in this
Even
entire meeting,
today.
have you said thank you?
And I thought high school was bad.
Real Housewives of the Potomac, some people were calling it. It was a remarkable thing. I'll discuss it in just a moment here, but just having watched it live on Friday, literally, I told the team, I was like, we're canceling all meetings for the afternoon. We had some planning things. We had a variety of things we were planning to do on a Friday afternoon. We're like, major news just happened. We were in breaking news mode for several hours there.
Minutes after the fight, Trump decided that Zelensky was, quote, not in a place to negotiate. He reportedly spoke with Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and other top advisors and decided to send Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation home immediately, canceling a lunch, press conference, and signing ceremony. Moshe, the lunch had been prepared. The food was like literally waiting for them.
It was in the hallway outside the Oval Office. I mean, this again was the beginning of the first meeting. And so ultimately White House staffers, I think they posted a few photos of it, ate the lunch that was supposed to be Zelensky and Trump's lunch.
So score one for the White House staffers. I think they're the only winners of that match.
There are no winners of this match. We'll explain in a second here, Jill.
So Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz delivered the news to the Ukrainians, who reportedly wanted to stay and work things out, but Trump refused, and the group left shortly after. The exchange ended any hope of signing that minerals deal last week or in the near future. On Friday evening, Zelensky remained in the U.S. for a Fox News appearance on Bret Baier's show, where he said he didn't think he needed to apologize and that allies need to be open and honest with one another, but that he still thinks that his relationship with Trump can be salvaged. White House officials say that they don't think the Fox News interview was sufficient. Some Republicans, including Senator Lindsey Graham, who has been very close to Zelensky, but he's also close to Trump, he implied that Zelensky might actually need to resign after this.
So I know I just said there were no winners. I think the winner of all this is Vladimir Putin, which I'll explain in a second. But this is nothing like we've seen before. Now, do world leaders fight with each other? Absolutely. Do they yell at each other? Sure. Do they do it in front of cameras? Almost never, especially with allies. We actually know that there was actually a conversation, at least one conversation, where Joe Biden yelled at Zelensky a couple of years ago for not being grateful enough. Though he did that, again, on the phone, privately, and then that eventually leaked out. Jill, this is a sort of scene that you read about in Bob Woodward books about various presidents, that you find out about afterwards, years later, and then you're like, did that actually happen? And people, put out denials typically.
Right. The lunch was waiting in the hall. The staffers ate it. And then you're like, wow, I was wondering what happened. You usually do not see video of it.
No, the vice president, saying to the leader of Ukraine, why haven't you said thank you? You haven't said thank you yet. And the leader of Ukraine saying, well, you just wait. This war is going to get here across the ocean sometime soon. I mean, you heard a bit of that in the clip we just played for you guys. So let's set the scene here for those of you who are unfamiliar. The way things go with a head of state visiting the White House is that they typically let the cameras into the Oval Office for just a couple minutes. And in most presidencies, it's very canned. I mean, literally, Biden used to hold a card that his staffers wrote some notes for him on, and he would read it to the cameras. The other leader then says something very short, typically very polite, pre-planned. They might take a question. The media might try to shout a question, and they boot them out after 2 or 3 minutes, and then they get to the meeting. And then after that meeting, they'll eventually hold a formal press conference where they're sitting at podiums, they got the flags behind them, and they take the formal questions from the media. Now, in the Trump era, it's just a rolling news conference. Like all day long is a news conference. Everything Trump does, sometimes he's taking questions for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour at things that most other presidents would either have had the media at for like 30 seconds or taken one question at. So this meeting happens in the Oval Office at the beginning of the talks, ahead of the lunch, as you explained. And the first 40 minutes goes pretty much according to plan. They're taking lots of questions. Certainly, Trump is saying things that are upsetting Zelensky and vice versa. Zelensky's talking about how much support he needs. Trump is talking about how people need to, change their language and how they talk about Vladimir Putin, and that, yes, some people don't like Putin, but some people also don't like Zelensky. He's saying that like 2 feet away from Zelensky. And so we're 40 minutes in. And then Trump calls for a final question. Before the final question is asked, J.D. Vance, who's sitting to the left of Trump on the couch next to Marco Rubio, decides he needs to chime in here. Because Trump actually just does the preceding message from Trump just before this was, some people don't like Zelensky either, and people better start talking nice about Russia at this point if you want this thing to end. Vance jumps in. And by the way, Vance did this a couple times last week. where he said something slightly more provocative. He did the same thing with the UK Prime Minister, though the UK Prime Minister didn't, take aim at him. He sort of tried to stay above the fray. So J.D. Vance says, listen, this is what we're doing because the Biden administration plan has not worked out for 4 years. Putting sanctions on Russia, pushing hard on Russia, making them an outcast. The war is still going on. And ultimately, we need to resolve this. And so the way to resolve this, we believe, is to actually engage with the Russians. Zelensky could have let that go. He didn't want to let that go. Zelensky takes that personally, even though ultimately it was more geared towards Biden than Zelensky. So Zelensky then chimes in and factually, accurately explains that over the course of the past 12 years or so, Vladimir Putin has broken every agreement that he signed with Ukraine. He took Crimea. They signed another deal. He then invaded. He's broken various deals in between then. And then ends that, as you heard in that message, with, what kind of diplomacy, JD, are you talking about? Throwing it back at the vice president, not calling him Mr. Vice President, calling him JD. And we should note that Vance had been calling him Mr. President of Ukraine. And then it was on, right? And then it's on, and that's the clip, that everyone has seen from that point on. But this is the background here, because I think a lot of people didn't have that full perspective, and people are like, how did this whole thing start? Remember also this, Jill. These people don't like each other. If you look back at the last U.S. Senate, there are 100 senators. The most anti-Ukraine senator in the U.S. Senate was J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance has, an interview that he did just before Putin invaded where he literally said, I don't care what happens to Ukraine. Like, I literally don't care. And he never visited Ukraine. He continued to push against supporting Ukraine this entire time. So Zelensky doesn't like him. J.D. doesn't like Zelensky. Trump doesn't like Zelensky because if you go back to the first term, Zelensky was president back then. You remember that the first Trump impeachment happened. Why? Because he called Zelensky and said, I want you to investigate the Bidens and in order to get aid from me. And this is before the Russian invasion, but he has his own conflict ongoing because the Russians were already fighting in the eastern provinces. He said, you'll get that aid if you investigate the Bidens. And of course, that would lead to his first impeachment, right? This whole quid pro quo question. So Zelensky tried to resolve some things with Trump in the fall. They tried to smooth things over. In the past couple of weeks, you had the whole back and forth where Trump called him a dictator. And Zelensky said to Trump, you're full of disinformation. And then, as we told you on Friday's podcast, it's so funny, Jill, I went back and listened to Friday's podcast where I was like, Trump's taking a new tack here. They're going to hug it out. Several hours later, that was not what they did. There was no hugging that took place. And so this whole thing felt like, they're going to just gloss over the fact that they really dislike each other and just sign the deal, which, by the way, Zelensky resents because he doesn't, he's signing away what he says is part of his economic future. But Trump says, you've taken, more than $180 billion in aid from us, and we want something in return.
By the way, we should also mention something else that seemed to irk the President Trump, besides for the body language. It was what Zelensky was wearing or wasn't wearing, or I should say that he wasn't wearing a suit. Now, he doesn't ever wear a suit since the war started, but the president seemed to think that it was disrespectful that he did not wear a suit for the Oval Office.
Yeah, actually, if you watch the clip, literally the first couple seconds, Zelensky comes out of the car. Trump goes to greet him. This is before the Oval Office. He's like, oh, look, you dressed up just for me. And then he points to him for the cameras being like, look, he dressed up for me. So apparently Trump's advisors had told the Ukrainians in advance, hey, can you make your guy wear a suit for the sake of the Oval Office? And actually it led to a whole interaction. One of the many questions over 40 minutes that Zelensky got was from a conservative commentator who happens to be Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend and found his way into the Oval Office saying, why don't you wear a suit? You're so disrespectful. And that led to like a whole exchange there as well. So there was just a lot there. And we'll get into the policy issues in just a second here. But now for the reaction. In Europe, Jill, within minutes, we were seeing posts on social media, European leaders saying, we're with Zelensky. They weren't necessarily targeting Trump for the most part, but just like, we stand with Ukraine. Russia's the aggressor. Russia's the aggressor. And there was actually the EU foreign policy chief said, it's time for a new leader of the free world. So that was more of a direct shot there. In Ukraine, it's been the vast majority of people in Ukraine supportive of Zelensky here. Some acknowledged in interviews that maybe he could have been a little more diplomatic, but given the dire straits the country's in, the war crimes committed against them since Russia's invaded, The fact that he's done more than $500 billion in damage to the country, 11 million people have been displaced, 3.5 million people are living under Russian occupation right now. They feel like it was on Zelensky to communicate that he's in a tough spot. Meanwhile, over in Russia, they love this. Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president, who is a close ally of Putin, he wrote over on X, "The insolent pig finally got a proper slapdown in the Oval Office." You had another Russian advisor say that they were surprised that Trump held back from physically slapping Zelensky. So that was Russia. They love this. They love seeing a split amongst the group of countries that has been supporting Ukraine here. And then in the U.S., domestic reaction, Republicans mostly supportive of Trump here. Some of them implying, again, that unless Zelensky properly apologizes or shows he's serious about ending the war, it might be time for him to resign. Among those is Speaker Mike Johnson. You also have Republicans who over the weekend said, listen, we're not in the business of telling democratically elected leaders like Zelensky to step down. Ultimately, we hope they're able to resolve things here. At the end of the day, Putin is the aggressor. That's something you heard from Republican Senator from Oklahoma, James Lankford. Democrats were pretty united in condemning the president, calling Zelensky a hero, criticizing the White House for abandoning allies. Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut writing, quote, "The White House has become an arm of the Kremlin." As for Zelensky, after being booted from the White House with no deal and no meal, White House staffers, we mentioned, ate the lunch that was set for him and Trump. Zelensky flew back to Europe for a warmer reception. On Saturday, Zelensky was in the UK. He met with Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who greeted him with a warm welcome and a big hug. He got a hug. He needed that hug after that day in Washington. It's okay. Come here. It's okay. You're in Great Britain now. Starmer agreed to give Kyiv a $2.8 billion loan to enhance Ukraine's defense capabilities and toward weapons production in the country. The loan will be repaid with revenues from frozen Russian assets. More than a dozen European leaders, plus the Canadian premier and the head of NATO, joined Starmer and Zelensky in London on Sunday for a meeting dubbed Securing Our Future. The emergency summit was called to map out a path forward for Ukraine and also to discuss how Europe can protect itself more effectively in a world where America is no longer guaranteeing the continent's security. Starmer laid out a plan for security guarantees for Ukraine from European countries and other allies, calling it a, quote, coalition of the willing. They indicated that those willing countries would commit military assets, including boots on the ground, to secure peace, but they urged more countries to join if they want to deter Russian aggression in the future. Starmer saying, quote, Europe must do the heavy lifting, a nod to the fact that the Trump administration has made it clear that it will not be providing security assistance or troops in Ukraine. The UK and France also say that they'll lead a European effort to create a peace plan to end the war and present that to President Trump for negotiations with the Russians. There is a European Union summit in Brussels on Thursday where leaders are expected to continue talking about boosting defense spending for Ukraine. So, Moshe, a lot of questions that we got this weekend. You did dozens of slides on the Mo News Instagram page and answered a ton of questions. One of them being, was this confrontation with Zelensky in the Oval Office a setup, as some Democrats are saying? So some Dems are saying that, he walked into a buzzsaw and this was pre-planned by J.D. Vance and President Trump. Let's back up here. What was this meeting for? Signing this minerals deal that had been talked about for weeks here and then finalized by the Treasury Secretary. Scott Bessent had gone to Ukraine, worked out a deal here. They were going to have a whole signing ceremony, a whole news conference. They had gotten Trump to tone down his language in recent days. And ultimately, for Trump, it's a big deal because if we're going to continue to give aid to Ukraine, he feels like the U.S. should get something in return. Compared to Europe, much of our aid has been grants. Much of the aid from Europe have been loans. And so he feels like we should be paid back in some way in the future for the investment that the U.S. has made in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine would not be standing today and holding back the Russians without all the U.S. aid. So they were ready to sign this deal. But against the backdrop that they don't like each other, but they just had to sort of smile for the cameras. Certainly Zelensky needed to. And again, they got through those first 40 minutes. Okay. But then some things that, each of them were saying were getting under their skin gradually. They probably should kick the cameras out of there earlier, but that'd be a different history timeline that we're living on. And they didn't. Trump kept repeating, we need to talk nicer about Putin. This guy keeps talking nasty about Putin. Understandably, Zelensky has a lot of bad things to say about Putin, given what he's done to his country. Now, again, Vance is in there sort of as a slight provocateur, being more explanatory, but supportive of Trump. And Zelensky is almost home free here to the meeting, to the lunch, and then the signing ceremony. I think ultimately, like if you look at the evidence, you look at the meeting, I don't think this was a pre-planned thing 40 minutes in. I think that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump were just saying their piece. Zelensky was saying his piece. But there's an expectation on the part of the president and J.D. Vance that when you come to the Oval Office asking for aid, that you're going to be more deferential, right? And so ultimately, they get towards that end, and that's when Zelensky directs that question back at Vance. That effectively questions the entire American strategy when it comes to diplomacy, which is engaging with the Russians on camera. Now, is that something he probably should have done off camera? Absolutely. Is it something he does all the time off camera? Absolutely. They felt, at least J.D. Vance said, that's disrespectful, which is a triggering thing for Trump. You could sort of see Trump nodding there. That you could also talk about just the overall Zelensky body language. He had his arms crossed the entire time. And so they just felt that he was coming in a way not respectful. And you mentioned the entire thing, too, of the president in the Oval Office. Nothing the president, J.D. Vance, said in that Oval Office conversation was different from what they say all the time. Frankly, some of it was actually nicer from Trump than what he normally says about Zelensky. And so the argument goes that if you are meeting with your banker / arms dealer, in this case, the United States, and your banker / arms dealer is saying things that are sort of underhanded, critical, that while the cameras are there, you got to keep your mouth shut. You disagree in private, not public. At least that's the assertion from some. But
don't air your dirty laundry, so to speak.
Yeah, there was a moment actually in 2011 where Netanyahu did that with Obama. But Netanyahu has found a way since then to navigate that stuff. He learned some lessons from the fallout there. So, not so long ago, the last administration, Biden openly derided Netanyahu, and Netanyahu did not ever make a point of criticizing him on camera in public in that way, because they're just, again, when you're a smaller nation getting aid from the U.S., even when that president is critical of you and saying things that are really upsetting you, right? If you're dependent on them and you're there representing your people and various needs, can you bite your tongue? Now, I'm sure there's people who listen to this podcast who are like, well, what Trump and Vance said was totally unacceptable. Sure, if you're Ukrainian, you take a lot of offense at that. But ultimately, what is the end goal for the leader? And so that's why I don't think this whole thing was planned. I think just, at some point, Zelensky felt he needed to say his piece, and it happened to be on camera, and then the whole thing unfolded. And Jill, there's a larger foreign policy shift that's happening here in terms of as we mentioned, the U.S. pivot away from Europe, questioning all relationships, NATO, the EU, a lot of implications here. We got into that over on the Mo News Premium Instagram account. We got a lot of new members there over the weekend. So join over there, mo.news/premium. That's where we've been answering all your questions related to what does this mean for the future of America, the future of alliances, as the Trump administration makes some of these major changes.
Okay, time now for the speed read from Newsweek. Elon Musk's team sent out a second round of emails on Friday, again instructing federal workers to list their accomplishments from the past week. This time, though, there is less pushback from agency leaders. The email is nearly identical to the one that was sent out last weekend, asking about 2 million workers to send a bullet point list of 5 of their accomplishments from the week prior that would be reviewed by top leaders. Musk posted on X that their silence would indicate resignation. Well, several of Trump's department leaders defied Musk's orders the last time around, telling their employees not to respond to the original email. Many were concerned about security clearance and sensitive information. The Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, which sent the email, said that workers would not be fired for failing to respond. But Musk doubled down on Saturday, posting on X The president has made it clear that this is mandatory for the executive branch. He said any workers in sensitive areas or working with sensitive information can just reply by saying it's sensitive. Among the departments telling employees, again, not to respond to the newest email, the State Department and NASA. However, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is supporting Musk's initiative this time, and he told his employees they should reply.
Yeah, we heard from a bunch of you who work at the Pentagon that you got an email, and there was this new message from Hegseth. It appears this is only the beginning here. Musk has mentioned that he got about half of federal employees to respond to the first email. That's about 1 million people who work in the federal government, given that they employ about more than 2 million people. Musk has described this as a pulse check. That's what he called it at last week's cabinet meeting. He says literally he wants to find out if, everyone who works there is alive. Again, no information that there's dead people on the payroll at any of these government agencies. But ultimately, they're presenting it that way. They have mentioned that they're not actually reading these emails. They're putting them into AI. So unclear what AI is going to assess or how they're going to assess needs and whether, what these accomplishments are sufficient. But keep in mind that OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, while it's the HR arm, ultimately they don't have power to fire people directly. That falls on the agencies and departments themselves. There has, of course, also been the buyout plan that's facing some legal issues right now. It's all part of DOGE's plan to cut $1 trillion or $2 trillion out of the budget, which is going to be super difficult because what they're going after, some of these contracts, as well as personnel, the salaries there certainly make up billions of dollars, several $1 billion, but we're talking about the annual budget, $7 trillion. And the vast majority of those funds are locked up in things like Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare, much more controversial to cut. So we'll continue to monitor all things DOGE. In the meanwhile, over on Saturday Night Live over the weekend, they have figured out who their actor is going to be for Elon Musk. Wayne Campbell, everybody. Remember Mike Myers from Wayne's World? Mike Myers, and by the way, he was Hans and Franz. He had a lot of famous sketches there back in the 80s and 90s. But Mike Myers was back playing Elon Musk, and I have to say, Jill, pretty good accent, pretty good impression of Elon from Mike Myers. Of course, if you're a Trump supporter, you probably hated the sketch. If you're a critic, you probably love the sketch. Nonetheless, I think that Mike does a pretty good Elon.
He seems to be going with the angle that Elon Musk is like part robot, because he would be like, I had like a glitch or something, like, okay, back to being a person.
Well, he does. He has
something.
very awkward physical gestures sometimes. So I think that's why I think he played it well. Like he clearly watched some videotape of Elon.
He also pointed out that another person who does not wear a suit in the Oval Office is Elon Musk, because on cue, I think that they were having, a J.D. Vance character and a Trump character talking about, who wouldn't wear a suit to the Oval Office? And then in walks Mike Myers as Musk in a T-shirt.
Yeah,
with like a blazer over it.
I think Musk typically he wears a baseball cap with a T-shirt and a blazer over it. Maybe that's how he gets away with it, Jill.
Another story we're tracking this week, the tariffs with Canada and Mexico are set to take effect tomorrow. After a few weeks' delay, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick saying on Sunday that the tariffs will go into effect Tuesday, but that President Trump will determine whether to stick with the planned 25% level, which is steep.
Yeah, these are the 25% tariffs that he announced more than a month ago and then postponed them due to concessions that both Mexico and Canada had made. Now he says the tariffs are on. Now we hear, at least according to Lutnick, that he said, quote, they've done a reasonable job of securing their borders. And so it might not be 25% when the tariffs actually start tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. There have been a lot of talks from various industries, given all the trade, there's a couple $1 trillion in trade we do with Mexico and Canada, to make a lot of exceptions. So look out for a slightly less aggressive tariff in the next 24 hours. If it happens altogether, I mean, there's always a chance, given what we've seen unfold here, that they could be postponed. Jill, one thing we'll be watching closely also tomorrow night is the address to the joint session of Congress, typically known as the State of the Union address. Though when it's a new president, it's not a State of the Union in the first year, but it presents like a State of the Union. He's going to talk before Congress. That's at 9 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow night. And stay tuned for our bingo card, our State of the Union bingo card. It'll be out tomorrow morning.
And you'll be in D.C., right, Moshe?
I am headed to D.C. Tuesday.
From the Associated Press, a 42-day initial phase ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas expired over the weekend. without any agreement on what comes next. Without an extension, a return to war is possible in the coming days. At the same time, Israel is refusing to let any trucks carrying aid into the Gaza Strip and warned of additional consequences if Hamas doesn't accept the terms of a new deal. So negotiations for phase 2 were supposed to start weeks ago, which would have led to the release of the remaining hostages and a more permanent end to the war, including Israel fully withdrawing from Gaza and then new rule for Gaza that does not include Hamas. But that negotiation never really got started. So in its place, Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, had proposed a temporary deal that would have basically just continued the first phase of the ceasefire agreement, and it would have bought leaders a little bit more time to negotiate the second phase. Israel agreed. Hamas, though, refused, accusing Israel of trying to derail negotiations. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the extension would have required Hamas release half of the remaining hostages on the first day, and the rest when the groups reached a permanent ceasefire deal. About half of the 58 hostages that are still in Gaza are believed to be alive, and that includes an American, Idan Alexander from Tenafly, New Jersey. The U.S. is blocking Israel's decision to block goods, including humanitarian aid, while negotiations are stalled. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that he used emergency authority to send an additional $4 billion in military assistance to Israel.
Yeah, so the U.S. behind Israel here as they tried to do this extension. Hamas is saying that Israel has broken things, so they're pointing fingers back at Israel for not following through with the traditional phase 2 negotiations here. Israel said basically either release all the hostages or step down from power or take this extension. But as far as they were concerned, the phase 2 talks about Israel completely withdrawing are not in the cards right now. And they know that they have backing here from the U.S. So this extension was supposed to take them through the Ramadan holiday that begins in the coming days here with the month-long Muslim holiday, as well as the Jewish holiday of Passover, which happens in mid-April. So this extension would have taken the deal through April 19th. It does not appear to be happening. War could be starting as we speak again, as you listen to this podcast. So we'll continue to monitor the details there. In the meantime, the aid cutoff here, Israel believes, again, that there's enough aid in Gaza to last months. All the aid that's come in there over the course of the first ceasefire here. And again, has the backing of the Americans on this, that they have shown over the course of the last year and a half that the only time Hamas actually makes concessions is actually when they ratchet things up in terms of pressure militarily and in terms of aid. And so that's what we're seeing right now, and we'll continue to monitor what happens.
From the New York Times, former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo announced that he is getting back into politics. This time, he is running for mayor of New York City. It comes 3 years after he resigned from the governorship amid nearly a dozen sexual harassment allegations. He's hoping to defeat the increasingly unpopular incumbent, Mayor Eric Adams, who faced corruption charges before he was accused of striking a deal with the Trump administration to drop them. Cuomo has a decade of experience as governor. He also was the state attorney general. He was a cabinet secretary during the Clinton administration. Add to that, he's got some deep-pocketed supporters and near universal name recognition, meaning he is expected to rise to front-runner status if he isn't there already. But he is not without baggage. The New York Attorney General released a report back in 2021, which concluded that Cuomo sexually harassed multiple women, including state employees. The report accused him of groping and kissing female staff and creating a toxic and retaliatory work environment.
The pushback you hear from Cuomo is that none of the legal cases got anywhere. Some of them were thrown out of court, and he feels good about moving forward. It's actually one of the reasons why he's postponed announcing until as late as he could wait here for the Democratic primary. Now, both of these men, Eric Adams and Andrew Cuomo, are Democrats, which means they face off in the primary in June. But given it's New York City, it's so heavily Democratic, that's basically the mayor's race. Who's ever running on the Republican side in the fall, unlikely to really get very far. So ultimately, this is the race we're going to be watching here through June. New York City has not had a Republican mayor since Rudy Giuliani, and it doesn't look like there's any major candidate there. So now you have this battle of these scandalous, scandal-filled, scandal-prone candidates. We've told you about Eric Adams, his federal indictments that were dropped for an alleged quid pro quo with the White House that's being investigated. And so Cuomo has his own baggage. By the way, it's not just the sexual harassment stuff. He's also accused of concealing damaging information related to nursing home deaths during COVID. He has stood by his decisions, but one of his decisions to allow COVID positive nursing home patients to return to their nursing homes is alleged to have led to thousands of people dying in nursing homes. So you can imagine that'll come up here. Cuomo didn't really talk about that in detail at all in his announcement video, which, by the way, Jill dropped on Saturday. It was a 17-minute video, basically a short film about what he'll do for New York. He mentioned homelessness and various progressive policies that he feels have brought New York City down, and says, listen, I've been here before. I've done this. Bring me back. And finally, from The Hollywood Reporter, we have some of the highlights from last night's Oscars. Nora dominated the Academy Awards last night, winning Best Picture as well as a number of other top awards. It's a sex worker dramedy, if you've seen it or heard of it. Sean Baker was the brainchild behind it. He won Best Directing as well as awards for his original screenplay and editing. In his acceptance speech, he said, I want to thank the sex worker community, my deepest respect. I share this with you. Mikey Madison also won Best Actress for playing the film's title role. She called winning an Oscar a dream come true. It was also a big night for The Brutalist. Adrian Brody won Best Actor for his performance as a Holocaust survivor in the film. The Brutalist also won for Best Cinematography and Best Score. Incidentally, it's Brody's second Oscar. He won back in 2003, 22 years ago, for playing a Holocaust survivor in the film The Pianist back then. Earlier in the night, they awarded Best Supporting Actress and Best Supporting Actor. Those awards went to Zoe Saldana and Kieran Culkin. Saldana was named Best Supporting Actress for a performance in the Spanish-language musical Emilia Perez about a drug lord who changes her gender. She gave a pretty powerful acceptance speech last night saying, my grandmother came to this country in 1961. I'm the proud child of immigrant parents, and I am the first American of Dominican origin to accept an Oscar. I know I will not be the last. Meanwhile, Kieran Culkin was named Best Supporting Actor for his performance in A Real Pain. That's a film about two cousins played by him and Jesse Eisenberg, who actually go on a Holocaust tour of Poland to remember their grandmother. You might remember Culkin from Succession. Incidentally, he was up for Best Supporting Actor against Jeremy Strong, his co-star from Succession. Jeremy Strong was nominated for Best Supporting Actor for his performance in The Apprentice, but lost. But Culkin made a point of beginning his speech last night by honoring his former Succession castmate. So those were the big awards last night. Wicked, one of the biggest films of the year, did go home with 2 Oscars for production design and costume design. The ceremony also began with a tribute to the city of LA, which had been ravaged by wildfires recently. Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo singing Defying Gravity, as well as Somewhere Over the Rainbow, as part of the opening sequence of the film. A couple of other mentions here. Dune Part 2 also got 2 Oscars. That was also one of the bigger films of the year. Conan O'Brien was the host last night. We'll say he had some good one-liners throughout the night. Had us wondering, though, where has he been? Conan O'Brien was the host last night, making his return to network television after going off into the podcast world the last few years. He did have a couple good one-liners. And then, of course, as always, at the Oscars, they always remember all the lives lost over the last year from the world of cinema. And that included, sadly, Gene Hackman, whose death we told you about last week and is still being investigated. All right, now time for On This Day in History. 94 years ago today, 1931. That's your answer for when we got a national anthem, an official one. The Star-Spangled Banner officially adopted as our national anthem by Congress. Nearly 150 years after independence there, Jill, so your 100 years guess was pretty close. 150 years until we finally got ourselves a national anthem. We had several unofficial anthems, including My Country 'Tis of Thee. But then the U.S. Navy adopted the Star-Spangled Banner as their anthem several decades previous to this announcement. And then at some point, presidents were like, we need a national anthem here in America. And so they went with the one you know today. On this day in 1991, over in LA, the tragic police beating of LA motorist Rodney King 34 years ago today. It was captured on camcorder at the time by a guy named George Holliday. Without that tape, there probably would have never been a trial. But even so, of the 4 officers who were eventually tried on charges of excessive force, 3 of them were acquitted. The jury failed to reach a verdict on 1 charge for the 4th. Within hours of the acquittals, the LA riots started, sparked by outrage from black residents over police brutality and the trial's verdict. The rioting in LA would last 6 days, killing 63 people. And this, of course, all a prelude to the O.J. Simpson trial just a couple years later. And so that was in the backdrop of a lot of people's minds. And we end here with a bit of pop culture and music history on this day in history. In 1972, Elton John released Rocket Man. So Rocket Man turns 53 years old today. On this day, 36 years ago, Like a Prayer by Madonna was released. And on this day in 2005, so 20 years old today, 50 Cent's The Massacre album, which gave us, among other things, Candy Shop and Disco Inferno.
I think it's 50 Cent.
Thank you for the correction. Moj, why did you pronounce the extra F in 50 Cent? How could you?
Okay, that was an annoying correction, so I do apologize.
You're like some of the people on Instagram who are like, you put the apostrophe in the wrong place. I was like, I did 27 slides in the last 4 hours, guys. Like, I will sometimes. There's no grammar check on the Instagram.
I was kind of kidding, though. I will say that.
I know. I don't take such things personally. That's like the best correction to get. You're like, Moshe, it's not 50 Cent, it's 50 Cent. I'm like, you're right. I should know better. I can't really
correct you about news usually, so yeah. I'll take this.
As an elder millennial, that's on the quiz.
Okay, thank you all for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
We love the reviews. Keep the reviews coming. Thanks, everybody.
The good ones.
Only the good ones. 5
The
stars.
kind ones. All right, bye, everyone.